What happens when an entire community agrees that reality runs in reverse and punishes anyone who speaks forward? Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing linguistic mysteries in American history. But before we descend into these isolated mountains, I need you to ask yourself, when does a shared belief become a shared delusion? When does tradition become psychological imprisonment? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe a community has the right to reshape reality itself for its children. Because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about language, memory, and the thin line between protection and control. This episode discusses themes of isolation, psychological manipulation, linguistic trauma, and community control. While no graphic violence is depicted, the psychological elements may be disturbing. Viewer discretion advised. In the archives of the Anthropological Society of America, there exists a field recording from 1968 that shouldn't exist 7 minutes of a child speaking perfect English, but every word emerging in reverse phonetic order, not backwards playback, not a recording artifact. A child who had learned to speak that way from birth, whose mouth and mind had been shaped to produce language in a direction that contradicts every principle of human speech development. We're about to delve into a mystery that destroyed families, erased a community from the map, and left linguistic researchers with questions that remain unanswered to this day. This is the story of Silence Valley, West Virginia, a place where everyone spoke backward, where children grew up believing the past was the future, where an entire community built a reality on reversal. And when the outside world finally discovered what was happening in that hidden hollow, the truth they uncovered was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. This isn't just a story about language. This is a question about how completely we can reshape human consciousness, and what happens when we try. It was the year 1967. America was fracturing. The summer of love giving way to the long hot summer, Vietnam protests intensifying, the generation gap becoming a chasm. But in the mountains of southern West Virginia, in a valley so remote it appeared on no maps, so isolated that the nearest town was 17 miles of unmarked forest trails away, a different kind of revolution had been quietly unfolding for nearly a century, a revolution not of politics or culture, but of reality itself. And it started with a single question: what if we could protect our children from the outside world by teaching them to speak a language no outsider could understand? The Appalachian Mountains hold secrets like the earth holds water, deep, dark, and impossible to fully drain. There are hollows in those ancient hills where sunlight penetrates for perhaps 4 hours a day, where mist clings to the ground like something living, where the trees grow so dense that visibility extends no more than 20 feet in any direction. The mountains have their own logic, their own rules, their own sense of time that moves differently than the world beyond their ridges. Silence Valley, and that name itself is a later invention, given by researchers who came after existed in one of these forgotten places. The valley floor ran perhaps 3 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point, hemmed in by steep ridges on all sides. A creek ran through the center, clear and cold, fed by springs that emerged from limestone caves scattered through the surrounding hills. 19 families lived there in 1967, 93 people total, counting the children. No roads led to Silence Valley. The nearest town, Marrow Creek, was accessible only by a trail that climbed 2 ridges and crossed 3 creek beds that became impassable during heavy rain. Electricity had never reached the valley. Neither had telephone lines, though by the late 60s, Marrow Creek itself had both. The families in Silence Valley lived much as their great-grandparents had in the 1880s, farming small plots, raising livestock, hunting and gathering from the forest, existing in a kind of temporal pocket where the 20th century was a distant rumor. But there was something else about Silence Valley, something that set it apart from the hundreds of other remote Appalachian communities scattered through those mountains. Something that became apparent the first time an outsider actually listened to the people who lived there. They spoke backward, not occasionally, not as some kind of game or code. Every word, every sentence, every conversation reversed. The phonemes emerged in the opposite order from Standard English, creating a sound that was hauntingly familiar yet completely incomprehensible. Linguistic researchers who later studied recordings described it as hearing English played in reverse at normal speed while maintaining natural prosody and rhythm. Your brain recognized it as human speech, as language, as something that should make sense. But it didn't. It couldn't, because they were speaking backward. The first documented encounter with this phenomenon came in August of 1967, when a forestry surveyor named Thomas Macready got lost during a survey of state land in the region. Macready, 34 years old, a veteran of the survey service with 12 years of experience navigating the most remote regions of West Virginia, found himself more thoroughly lost than he'd been in his entire career. His compass had malfunctioned, or so he thought, and after 2 days of trying to orient himself, he stumbled into Silence Valley just after dawn on a Thursday morning, dehydrated, exhausted, and desperate for help. What he found seemed like salvation: cultivated fields, a cluster of houses, smoke rising from chimneys. People. What he experienced there would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his report to the Forest Service, later archived and discovered by researchers in 2003, Macready described his first encounter with the valley's inhabitants. I approached what appeared to be a farmhouse of simple but solid construction. A woman was hanging laundry on a line in the yard. She saw me approach and called out. That's the only word I have for it, called out. But the sounds that emerged from her mouth made no sense. At first, I thought she was speaking a foreign language, perhaps German or Russian, something Slavic. But as I got closer, as I listened more carefully, I realized with a creeping sense of wrongness that I was hearing English. English spoken in some way I couldn't comprehend. English that sounded like English but wasn't. The woman, later identified as Martha Hendricks, age 43, mother of 5, seemed disturbed by Macready's presence but not frightened. She called out again, and this time others emerged from nearby houses. Men, women, children, all speaking in the same backward tongue. Macready tried to explain his situation. He was lost. He needed water, food, directions back to Marrow Creek. The people gathered around him, conferring among themselves in their reversed speech, their faces showing concern, but also something else. Something Macready described as a kind of deep suspicion, as if my very presence was a contamination. Finally, an older man, Samuel Hendricks, age 68, the informal leader of the community, approached with a canteen of water and a cloth bundle that contained bread and dried meat. But he wouldn't speak to Macready directly. He set the items on the ground and backed away, gesturing for Macready to take them and leave. He pointed toward the eastern ridge. Macready wrote, and though I couldn't understand his words, his meaning was clear: go, leave, you are not welcome here. Macready took the offered supplies and left. It took him another full day to find his way out of the mountains, following the eastern ridge until he finally encountered a logging road. He told his story to his supervisor, who dismissed it as the confused recollection of a man who'd been lost and dehydrated for 3 days. Strange dialect, the supervisor suggested. Appalachian isolation creating unusual linguistic patterns. Nothing more, but Macready couldn't let it go. the sound of that backward speech haunted him. He described it in his journal, like hearing time run in the wrong direction, like standing at the edge of a world that had somehow inverted itself. 3 months later, in November of 1967, Macready returned to the area with 2 colleagues and recording equipment. This time he was prepared. This time he would document what he'd found. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Silence Valley had been preparing for this moment for nearly 80 years. The history of Silence Valley begins with a man named Elijah Kane, and a tragedy so profound that it bent an entire community toward madness disguised as protection. The year was 1889. Elijah Kane was a schoolteacher, 42 years old, educated at a seminary in Virginia, a man who had chosen to return to the mountains of his birth to serve the scattered communities there. He was, by all accounts, a good teacher patient, knowledgeable, deeply committed to providing education to children who might otherwise grow up illiterate in those remote hollows. But Elijah Kane had lost his daughter. Sarah, 8 years old, had been taken from the one-room schoolhouse in Marrow Creek by a stranger passing through, a drifter, a traveler, someone the small community had welcomed with traditional Appalachian hospitality toward those passing through. The man had asked to use the outhouse. Instead, he had entered the schoolhouse while Kane was outside drawing water, had taken Sarah, and had vanished into the forest. They found her body 3 days later, 2 miles downstream in the creek. The details don't need to be repeated here. What matters is the effect it had on Elijah Kane, and what he did next. According to court documents from Greenbrier County, Kane was arrested in March of 1890 for disturbing the peace and promulgating dangerous ideas. The specific charge stemmed from his attempt to establish what he called a community of protection, where children would be taught to speak in a way that no outsider could corrupt, no stranger could command, no evil influence could reach. He had developed a system, a method of teaching children to reverse their speech from the earliest age, to literally think and speak backward, creating what he believed would be an impenetrable linguistic shield. If children spoke backward, he reasoned, then any stranger attempting to lure them away would be immediately identifiable by their inability to communicate in the reversed speech. The children would be safe because they would literally be unable to understand or obey commands from anyone outside their protected community. The court found him unfit to teach. He was banned from operating schools and ordered to cease his dangerous linguistic experiments. But Elijah Kane was undeterred. If the law wouldn't allow him to protect children through his system, he would find those who agreed with him. He would create a community where his vision could be realized. In April of 1890, Kane and 6 families, 28 people total, left established communities and moved deeper into the mountains, eventually settling in the isolated valley that would become Silence Valley. And there, hidden from the law and the outside world, Kane began his great experiment in linguistic protection. The children born in Silence Valley after 1890 were raised from birth hearing only backward speech. Their parents spoke to them in reverse. Their lullabies were reversed. Every word they learned, every sentence they formed, emerged in the opposite phonetic direction from Standard English. According to a diary fragment discovered in the abandoned valley in 1972, one of the founding mothers wrote, "Elijah says the children's minds must be shaped from the start, like bending a sapling to grow in the direction you choose. By the time they are old enough to walk beyond our sight, their very thoughts will run backward, making them immune to the forward, speaking corruption of the world beyond our protection." But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. It worked. The neurological plasticity of young children allowed them to acquire backward speech as naturally as any child acquires language. Brain scans conducted in the 1990s on 2 survivors of Silence Valley showed that the language centers of their brains had literally developed differently, processing speech in reverse order as fluently as typical speakers process forward speech. The children of Silence Valley grew up in a linguistic reality that was inverted, and because they knew no other way, they believed it was normal, natural, the way things were supposed to be. But what Elijah Kane didn't account for, or perhaps didn't care about, was what this would cost the children when they grew older. What it would mean to exist in a world that speaks forward when your entire cognitive architecture is built for reverse. By 1967, 3 generations had been born in Silence Valley speaking backward. 3 people living in complete linguistic isolation, their reality inverted, their connection to the outside world severed not by distance alone, but by the fundamental structure of their speech. And then Thomas Macready and his colleagues returned with recording equipment, and the isolation began to crumble. The second expedition to Silence Valley took place on November 14, 1967. Thomas Macready returned with James Whitlock, a linguist from West Virginia University, and Catherine Moore, an anthropologist interested in isolated Appalachian communities. They brought recording equipment, cameras, notebooks, and a determination to document what Macready had encountered 4 months earlier. What they didn't bring was permission. The valley was technically on private land, passed down through generations, though the property boundaries had never been formally surveyed or recorded with the county. The researchers justified their presence as academic inquiry into a unique linguistic phenomenon. Looking back, this casual violation of the community's privacy and autonomy would be recognized as the first of many ethical failures in how the outside world approached Silence Valley. But in November of 1967, Macready and his colleagues simply walked into the valley, set up their equipment, and began recording. The reception this time was markedly different from Macready's first encounter. The community had clearly discussed his previous visit. They knew what recording equipment looked like. Several of the older residents had been to Marrow Creek in their youth, before the linguistic isolation became absolute. They knew what the presence of outsiders with cameras and microphones meant. Samuel Hendricks, the community's elder, approached the researchers with several other men flanking him. This time he attempted to communicate, speaking slowly in the backward tongue, gesturing, trying to make himself understood through context and tone if not through words. James Whitlock had prepared for this. He'd brought a portable reel tape recorder and a plan. He would record the backward speech, return to the university, and attempt to analyze it by playing the recordings in reverse. If the speech was simply phonetically reversed, playing it backward should render it comprehensible. He explained this plan through gestures and drawings in a notebook, showing Hendricks a simple diagram of sound waves reversed. Hendricks watched, his face unreadable, then turned and spoke to the other men. The discussion that followed was intense, passionate, full of gestures toward the researchers and toward the houses where children could be seen watching from windows. Finally, Hendricks made a decision. He nodded. He would allow them to record, but on one condition, conveyed through an elaborate pantomime. They could record the adults, but they were not to approach the children, not to speak to them, not to let the children hear forward speech. Macready agreed. They spent the next 3 hours recording conversations, working with Hendricks and several other adults who volunteered to be recorded. Catherine Moore took extensive notes on the community's material culture, the style of houses, farming methods, clothing, tools. Everything she observed suggested a community that had remained virtually unchanged since the late 19th century. But there was something else more noticed, something she would later describe as profoundly unsettling. The children of Silence Valley were watching them with a hunger that went beyond curiosity, a yearning. Several of the older children, teenagers, she estimated, kept approaching, kept trying to get closer to hear the researchers speak forward, only to be firmly redirected by adults. One girl, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, managed to get close enough to whisper something to Moore before being pulled away by an older woman. The words were in backward speech, but the girl's face, Moore wrote in her field notes, showed desperate pleading, as if she were begging for rescue from drowning. That night, back in Marrow Creek, James Whitlock played the recordings in reverse. The result changed everything. What emerged from the reversed playback was perfect, fluent English with a distinct Appalachian accent characteristic of the late 19th century. Hendricks and the other adults spoke in grammar patterns and vocabulary that predated modern linguistic shifts, as if the language itself had been preserved in amber along with the community. But it was the content of what they said that made Whitlock call an emergency meeting with his colleagues. The recordings included a conversation between Hendricks and two other men, discussing what to do about the forward speakers who had come to their valley. Translated from the reversed playback, the conversation went like this. First man, they'll bring the corruption, just like Elijah warned. Once the children hear forward speech, the protection breaks. A Hendricks, the protection held for 77 years, but I don't know if it can hold against this, against them bringing their machines, their recordings. Second man, we should have turned them away with force if necessary. We should have protected the boundary absolutely. Hendricks, no. If we act with violence, they'll return with law, with authority that can force us out. We have to show them we're peaceful, harmless, just people who want to be left alone, and hope they lose interest and leave. First man, but what about the older children? You've seen how they look at these outsiders, Sarah's girl especially. She's been trying to teach herself forward speech from the old books. She wants out. Hendricks, then we'll deal with Sarah's girl the way we've dealt with others who tried to leave, the way we've always protected the community. Silence on the recording. Then the second man, I don't like it. She's just 16. To use the silence room on someone so young. Hendricks, would you rather she leave, rather she go into the forward world, unable to communicate, unable to function, and bring shame and questions back on us? The silence room is mercy compared to what would happen to her out there. The silence room. Those two words would become the key to understanding the true horror of Silence Valley. Because the community hadn't just created a linguistic protection system, they'd created an enforcement system, a punishment for those who tried to break free. Catherine Moore's field notes from the next day include this observation. Asked Hendricks through pantomime about education for children. He took me to a small building separate from houses about 8 feet by 8 feet, stone construction, no windows, single door with a lock. Inside, completely dark, walls covered with some kind of absorptive material that deadened all sound. He indicated through gestures that children who spoke wrongly or forgot the protection were placed inside to remember the silence. When I asked how long, he held up fingers. 3 days. 3 days of complete sensory deprivation for children who attempted to speak forward or who expressed desire to leave the valley. This wasn't just linguistic isolation. This was systematic psychological conditioning through punishment. The protection Elijah Kane had created wasn't just about keeping strangers out. It was about keeping the children in, ensuring they couldn't leave even if they wanted to, because their backward speech would make them incomprehensible to anyone outside the valley. But there was something even more, and her colleagues didn't discover during that visit. Something that wouldn't come to light until much later. Some of the children who'd been placed in the silence room never came out the same, and a few never came out at all. The three researchers left Silence Valley on November 16th with hours of recordings, extensive field notes, and a growing sense that they'd documented something far more disturbing than a mere linguistic curiosity. But they made a crucial error. They assumed they'd been thorough, that they'd seen all there was to see. They hadn't noticed the small cemetery on the eastern edge of the valley, partially hidden by overgrown trees. They hadn't counted the graves, and they hadn't asked about the missing children. Back at the university, Whitlock presented his findings to the linguistics department. The response was immediate and intense. A community speaking fluent backward English from birth was unprecedented in linguistic research. The implications for understanding language acquisition, neural plasticity, and the relationship between language and thought were enormous. By December, plans were underway for a full research expedition to Silence Valley. Linguists, anthropologists, neurologists, psychologists, all wanting to study this unique community. Papers were being drafted, grant applications submitted. The researchers talked excitedly about one of the most significant linguistic discoveries of the 20th century. None of them had bothered to ask whether the people of Silence Valley wanted to be studied, whether they'd consented to having their lives examined, their speech analyzed, their children treated as research subjects. And none of them had considered what the community might do to preserve their isolation when they realized the outside world wouldn't leave them alone. On December 18, 1967, a fire burned through 3 houses in Silence Valley. The official report from the county sheriff, filed weeks later after a passing hunter reported seeing smoke, listed the cause as accidental, and the casualties as 3 adults, circumstances unknown. But there was no official report about why those 3 adults died in the fire, while the other members of the community successfully evacuated. No investigation into whether the fire was actually an accident. What researchers later pieced together from fragments of testimony suggests that the 3 who died, 2 men and 1 woman, had argued against the use of the silence room, had advocated for allowing the older children to choose whether to learn forward speech, had questioned whether Elijah Kane's vision of protection had become a prison. The community, it seems, enforced protection not only on the children, but on any adult who threatened to break the isolation from within. By January of 1968, when researchers from the university returned to Silence Valley with authorization from the state to conduct their comprehensive study, they found a community that had made a decision. The adults had discussed the inevitable intrusion. They'd weighed their options. And they'd concluded that the only way to preserve their way of life was to make a demonstration that would convince the outside world there was nothing worth studying in Silence Valley. They would cooperate. They would allow researchers to study them, to record them, to examine their children, but only on the community's terms, and those terms included a very specific presentation of what Silence Valley was. An isolated community with an unusual dialect, nothing more. A linguistic curiosity that, upon closer examination, would prove less interesting than initially believed. What followed was one of the most successful campaigns of deliberate misdirection in the history of anthropological research. The comprehensive study of Silence Valley began in January 1968 and continued through April of that same year. 15 researchers rotated through the valley in groups of 3 to 5, spending anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks documenting various aspects of the community. What they found contradicted the earlier reports in subtle but significant ways. Yes, the adults spoke in what appeared to be reversed phonetic English. But when researchers played the recordings backward, the results were less clear than Whitlock's initial recordings had suggested. The backward playback produced something that sounded like English but was distorted, unclear, harder to understand than the clean translations Whitlock had achieved. Had the community deliberately altered their speech patterns to confuse analysis? Years later, linguistic forensics would suggest yes, the adults of Silence Valley had modified their reversed speech to include deliberate distortions, false starts, and phonetic inconsistencies that made backward playback analysis nearly impossible. The children, researchers noted, spoke less than expected. When asked questions through translators attempting to learn the backward speech, the children's responses were brief, monosyllabic, carefully monitored by watching parents. Several researchers noted that the children seemed coached, their answers too similar, too uniform. Catherine Moore, returning for a second visit in February, tried to interview the teenage girl who'd approached her during the first visit. The girl Hendricks had called Sarah's girl in the recorded conversation, but the girl was not available. The community reported she had gone to stay with relatives in another valley, that she would not be returning during the research period. Moore noted in her journal, "I don't believe them," something about the way they avoided eye contact when explaining her absence, something about how the other children reacted, a kind of fearful silence when I asked where she was. But Moore had no authority to demand answers, no legal standing to investigate further. She was a guest, tolerated but not trusted, and she knew that pushing too hard would result in the community refusing further cooperation. The silence room was presented to researchers as a kind of meditation chamber, a quiet space where children could go to center themselves when overwhelmed. The absorptive walls were explained as necessary because the valley's acoustics made all sound carry too well, and children needed absolute quiet sometimes. Some researchers believed this explanation. Others, like Moore, did not. But without evidence of abuse, without testimony from the children themselves, there was nothing to investigate formally. The most telling finding came from the neurologist on the team, Dr. Robert Ashford. He conducted basic cognitive assessments on 12 children ranging from ages 5 to 17. What he found was disturbing. All of the children showed signs of linguistic confusion when presented with visual tests that required no spoken response. Tests that typically assess logical sequencing, temporal reasoning, and causal understanding. The children consistently reversed sequences. If shown a series of pictures depicting a story from beginning to end, they would arrange them backward. If asked to predict what came next in a pattern, they would suggest what came before. Their entire cognitive framework for time, sequence, and causality appeared to be inverted. Ashford wrote in his report, "These children do not simply speak backward, they think backward. Their understanding of temporal flow, of cause and effect, of narrative sequence, has been fundamentally altered by their linguistic development. I cannot determine whether this is a result of neural plasticity adapting to reversed speech patterns, or whether there has been deliberate psychological conditioning to reinforce this inverted cognition. What I can say with certainty is that these children would be profoundly disabled if removed from this community. They cannot function in a world that moves forward when their minds are structured to move backward." This was exactly what the community wanted researchers to conclude. That removing the children would be cruel. That Silence Valley, however strange, was the only place these children could live successfully. That intervention would be more harmful than leaving them alone. In April of 1968, the research team presented their preliminary findings at a conference. The conclusion was carefully worded but clear. Silence Valley represented an interesting linguistic anomaly, but the community should be left undisturbed. Further study would likely yield diminishing returns and could potentially harm the subjects by disrupting their isolated but functional community structure. The academic world, satisfied that the phenomenon had been documented and explained, moved on to other research questions. Silence Valley faded from wider attention, and in that fading, in that withdrawal of scrutiny, the people of Silence Valley believed they had won. They had protected their isolation. They had preserved Elijah Cain's vision. The outside world had looked, examined, and decided to leave them alone. But they were wrong, because two people who'd been part of the research expedition couldn't let it go. Catherine Moore and Thomas Macready both believed that something terrible was being hidden in Silence Valley. And over the next 2 years, working independently at first and then together, they would uncover the truth that the community had successfully concealed from 15 trained researchers. The truth about what happened to the children who tried to speak forward. Catherine Moore's breakthrough came in July of 1969, more than a year after the official research had concluded. She'd maintained contact with one family in Marrow Creek, the Pritchetts, who occasionally traded with Silence Valley residents for goods neither community could produce themselves. Through the Pritchetts, Moore learned that 3 families had left Silence Valley in the spring of 1969, abandoning the community and moving to Marrow Creek. This was unprecedented. In 80 years, no family had left Silence Valley intact. Individual adults had occasionally left, usually the youngest generation who'd been born there and wanted out. But they'd left alone, severing all ties with their families. Entire families leaving together suggested something had fundamentally changed in the valley. Moore traveled to Marrow Creek in August and, with the Pritchetts' help, located one of the families who'd left the Talberts. Robert and Mary Talbert, both in their 30s, with 3 children ages 8, 11, and 14. They'd been living in a small rented house on the edge of Marrow Creek for 4 months, and the children were attending public school for the first time in their lives. What Moore discovered during her interviews with the Talberts would eventually bring the full weight of state intervention down on Silence Valley. The Talberts had left because of their oldest child, Rebecca, age 14. Rebecca had spent 9 days in the silence room the previous winter for attempting to teach herself forward speech using an old grammar primer that had belonged to her grandmother. 9 days of complete darkness and silence, alone, at age 13. When she emerged, something had broken in her. She'd stopped speaking entirely backward or forward. She'd developed a severe startle response to sudden sounds or movements. She'd begun having seizures, though she'd never had them before. The Talberts, desperate to help their daughter, had made the radical decision to leave, to abandon 80 years of family tradition, to risk the condemnation of the entire community, and to flee to the forward, speaking world they'd been taught to fear. In Marrow Creek, with access to medical care, Rebecca was diagnosed with severe trauma, induced neurological damage. The prolonged sensory deprivation, a doctor explained, had literally damaged her developing brain. The seizures might be permanent. The psychological trauma would require years of therapy, if she could even access appropriate therapy given her backward speech. But Rebecca told Moore something else, something that changed everything. She told Moore about the cemetery. Through a combination of backward speech that Moore had partially learned, written notes, and painstaking pantomime, Rebecca revealed that there were 23 graves in the small cemetery on the valley's eastern edge. 13 of them were children, and at least 7 of those children had died during or shortly after being placed in the silence room. The official story, the one told to researchers, was that Silence Valley had been remarkably healthy, with low childhood mortality given their isolation. But that was a lie. The silence room, used as punishment for children who tried to speak forward or who wanted to leave, had killed multiple children over the decades through dehydration, hypothermia, or simply the shock of absolute sensory deprivation at too young an age. The community had buried them quietly, had told no one outside the valley, had created death certificates that listed natural causes when they filed them at all, and had used the threat of the silence room to control every subsequent generation. Rebecca herself had been in the silence room 4 times between the ages of 8 and 13. The final 9-day punishment had nearly killed her. The Talberts had left because they feared the next time would. Moore immediately contacted Thomas Macready with this information. Macready, who'd been quietly investigating property records and historical documents related to Silence Valley, had discovered something equally disturbing. Elijah Kane had been investigated for child abuse in 1891, just 1 year after establishing Silence Valley. A traveling preacher had reported seeing signs of physical punishment and hearing a child screaming from a locked building during a visit to the new community. But the investigation had gone nowhere. Kane and the families had successfully convinced the single deputy who'd made the trek to investigate that everything was fine, that the screaming had been a child having a tantrum, that their isolated life was peaceful and lawful. The deputy, unwilling to spend days in the remote valley conducting a thorough investigation, had filed a report clearing Kane of wrongdoing. That deputy's cursory investigation had enabled 80 years of systematic child abuse. Moore and Macready brought their findings to the state, to Child Welfare Services, to the county sheriff. By October of 1969, an official investigation into Silence Valley was launched, with the specific mandate to inspect the cemetery, examine the silence room, and interview children without adult supervision. On October 23, 1969, a team of 6 people entered Silence Valley: 2 sheriff's deputies, a state social worker, a translator who'd learned basic backward speech from Moore's recordings, a physician, and Catherine Moore herself. What they found was an empty community. Every house abandoned, livestock turned loose, gardens left unharvested, the chapel where the community had gathered for services empty, the silence room unlocked, its heavy door standing open, the interior stripped of the sound, dampening material that had lined its walls. And in the cemetery, 3 graves, exactly as Rebecca had described, 13 marked with stones bearing children's names and dates. The earliest from 1890, 2 just 2 years after the community's founding, and the most recent from 1966. A child named Thomas Hendricks, age 7, grandson of Samuel Hendricks. The physician examined the graves without disturbing them, noting signs that several had been filled hurriedly, without the usual depth or care. He recommended exhumation to determine actual causes of death, but that would require court orders, family notifications, extensive legal processes. While the official team was debating their next steps, Catherine Moore made one final discovery. In the chapel, beneath a loose floorboard in what had been the pulpit area, she found a journal. It was Elijah Kane's journal, maintained from 1890 until his death in 1924, and then continued by successive community leaders up through 1967. The journal documented everything: the development of the backward speech system, the first children raised in reverse, the establishment of the silence room as punishment for forward corruption, and, most damningly, the deaths of children in that room recorded with cold precision. September 1890, 2 Benjamin, age 6, placed in protection chamber for speaking forward after encounter with traitor, 5 days, did not emerge. His weakness proves the necessity of earlier and more complete training. April 1898, Martha, age 9, 7 days in protection for attempting to leave. Severe dehydration. Died 2 days after removal. The protection saved her from the worse fate of Forward World. December 1909, Samuel and Ruth, ages 7 and 5, 3 days in protection after being caught playing games in forward speech. Samuel recovered. Ruth did not. Her sacrifice strengthened our resolve. Entry after entry. Death after death. Children as young as 4 years old placed in sensory deprivation chambers for the crime of speaking normally, of wanting to learn the language of the world beyond their valley, of trying to escape a prison they hadn't chosen, and throughout the journal, a consistent theme: these deaths were necessary. They were protection. They were martyrs to the cause of preserving the community's isolation. Elijah Kane had created a system where killing children was reframed as saving them from a worse fate. By the time the official team left Silence Valley on October 25th, carrying Elijah Kane's journal as evidence, one thing was clear: every adult who'd remained in the community was complicit in decades of child abuse and multiple deaths, and now, warned somehow of the investigation, likely by sympathizers in Marrow Creek, they had fled. The largest manhunt in West Virginia history began the next day. Between October and December of 1969, authorities located and arrested 17 adults who'd been living in Silence Valley. They found them scattered across 3 states, some in remote cabins in Kentucky, others in small towns in Virginia, a few living under assumed names in Tennessee. What they didn't find were most of the children. Of the 40, 2 children under age 18 who'd been living in Silence Valley in 1967, only 9 were recovered with their arrested parents. The others had vanished. The trials that followed were complicated by the backward speech of the defendants. Special translators had to be brought in, working from Moore's research and the help of the few families who'd left the valley voluntarily. Even then, translation was imperfect, leading to multiple appeals based on whether the defendants truly understood the proceedings against them. Samuel Hendricks, the community's elder, was the first to be tried. The charges: conspiracy to commit child abuse, child endangerment resulting in death, and 7 counts of criminally negligent homicide for the children who died in the silence room during his time as community leader. The trial was a circus. Hendricks spoke only in backward speech, refusing to learn or use forward English even in his own defense. His court-appointed attorney argued that Hendricks genuinely believed he'd been protecting the children, that his actions, however misguided, came from a sincere religious and philosophical belief in the necessity of linguistic isolation. The prosecution countered with Elijah Kane's journal, with Rebecca Tolbert's testimony about her 9 days of torture, with medical evidence from the exhumed bodies of 3 children whose deaths had been listed as natural, but who showed signs of severe dehydration and starvation. In February of 1970, Samuel Hendricks was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 11, dying in 1980, 1 at age 80, 2 having never spoken a word of forward English. To the end, he maintained through translators that he'd done what was necessary to protect his community from corruption. 14 other adults received sentences ranging from 3 to 12 years. 2 were acquitted on the grounds that they'd been born in Silence Valley and were themselves victims of the system, even as they'd perpetuated it as adults. The legal and moral questions their cases raised: at what point does a victim become a perpetrator, especially when raised in a closed system from birth, remain unresolved in legal scholarship to this day. But the question everyone kept asking, The question that haunted Catherine Moore for the rest of her life was, where were the missing children? Extensive searches of the mountains around Silence Valley turned up nothing. Appeals to the arrested adults produced either silence or claims of ignorance. Some suggested the children had been taken to other isolated communities, places even more remote than Silence Valley, where backward, speaking families still lived. Others hinted darkly that the children had been protected permanently before the authorities arrived. Of the missing 33 children, only 4 were ever found. In 1970, two sisters, ages 9 and 13, were discovered living with a family in rural Kentucky who claimed to have adopted them through informal arrangements with their parents. The girls spoke backward speech and showed signs of severe mental delays and trauma. They were placed in specialized foster care, but struggled profoundly. The younger girl, placed in a facility for language disorders, never successfully learned forward speech despite years of therapy. The older girl learned enough forward speech to communicate basic needs, but described feeling as though she was living in a film played in the wrong direction, where everything moved the way her brain told her it shouldn't. In 1976, a boy identified as having been from Silence Valley was found living on the streets of Charleston, West Virginia. He was approximately 16 years old, nonverbal, severely malnourished. He'd apparently been abandoned when the community fled and had somehow survived in the wilderness for years before making his way to the city. He never spoke backward or forward, and died in state care in 1983, his identity never conclusively confirmed. In 1989, a woman came forward claiming to be Sarah's daughter, the teenage girl who'd approached Catherine Moore during the first research visit in 1967. She was 37 years old, had taught herself forward speech through extraordinary effort, and was coming forward, she said, because she'd recently had a daughter of her own and could no longer live with the silence about what had happened in Silence Valley. Her testimony revealed the final, most disturbing truth about the community. The missing children hadn't been taken to other valleys or killed. They'd been deliberately scattered among sympathetic families throughout Appalachia, families who agreed with Elijah Cain's vision and were willing to raise backward, speaking children in continued isolation, a network of protection that ensured the linguistic experiment would continue even if Silence Valley itself was destroyed. Some of those children, she said, are still out there, now adults in their 50s and 60s, living in remote hollows, speaking backward to children and grandchildren who have never heard forward speech, keeping the experiment alive. Law enforcement attempted to follow up on her claims, but found the Appalachian communities she'd named deeply resistant to outside investigation. Without specific evidence of ongoing abuse, without the resources for extensive searches of thousands of square miles of remote mountain territory, the investigation eventually stalled. To this day, the FBI maintains an open case file on the missing children of Silence Valley. To this day, there are occasional reports usually dismissed as legend or misunderstanding of people in remote areas of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia who speak in a backward tongue. And to this day, no one knows exactly how many people are still living the linguistic reality that Elijah Cain created over a century ago. Silence Valley itself was never reoccupied. The state seized the property through eminent domain in 1971, citing it as a crime scene and site of historical significance. For several years, it was maintained as an anthropological research site, with the houses, chapel, and silence room preserved as they'd been found. But maintaining a site that remote proved impractical. By 1975, vandals had damaged several buildings. The silence room was deliberately destroyed. Local people said it was too disturbing to leave standing, that children from nearby Marrow Creek were having nightmares about being locked in the dark stone chamber. In 1978, the state allowed the remaining structures to be dismantled. The land was returned to wilderness. The cemetery was the only thing left intact, enclosed by a fence and marked with a simple historical marker that reads, Silence Valley Cemetery, in memory of the children lost to isolation. 1892-1966. Catherine Moore continued her anthropological work, but never published a comprehensive account of Silence Valley. In her later years, she stated that she couldn't find a way to tell the story that didn't either sensationalize the suffering of the children or risk romanticizing Elijah Cain's vision as some kind of noble experiment gone wrong. She died in 2003, leaving behind extensive archives donated to West Virginia University, where they remain available to researchers. Thomas Macready left the Forest Service in 1971 and devoted the rest of his career to advocating for the protection of isolated communities from exploitation by researchers and outsiders. He argued that Silence Valley represented not just the abuse within the community, but the abuse by the outside world, researchers who treated human beings as fascinating objects of study without meaningful consent, media that sensationalized suffering, authorities who intervened only after decades of harm. He may have been right. The outside world discovered Silence Valley, examined it, exposed its horrors, prosecuted its leaders, and then moved on. But the scattered survivors, the children who'd been raised speaking backward, who'd been tormented in the silence room, who'd lost siblings and friends to Elijah Cain's vision of protection, they didn't get to move on. They had to live with backward speech in a forward world for the rest of their lives. Rebecca Talbert, whose testimony had been crucial in the initial investigation, struggled for years with the neurological damage from her 9 days in the silence room. She learned enough forward speech to communicate, but never felt comfortable in it. She described it as speaking with my mouth while my brain screamed in the opposite direction. In a 1992 interview, she said, "People ask me if I'm glad my parents got us out, glad the authorities shut down Silence Valley. I tell them yes, I'm glad. But I also tell them that getting out didn't save me. I'm still trapped in that dark room. I'm still speaking backward in my head. I just learned to translate fast enough that most people don't notice I'm doing it." She died by suicide in 1998 at age 44. Her death certificate listed contributing factors as severe and chronic PTSD and linguistic dissociation disorder. The linguistic community has debated Silence Valley extensively. Some argue it proves the incredible plasticity of the human brain, the way consciousness can be shaped by language even to the point of inverting basic cognitive structures. Others see it as proof of how language can be weaponized, how isolating people linguistically is as effective as physically imprisoning them. Brain scans of the few survivors who have agreed to participate in research show permanent alterations in the language centers and sequential reasoning areas of the brain. These changes appear to be irreversible. A person raised speaking backward from birth cannot simply learn forward speech and return to normal cognitive function. The neural pathways have developed in fundamentally different directions, which means Elijah Cain succeeded in a terrible way. He created a linguistic prison so complete that even after the physical isolation ended, even after the authorities intervened, even after the children were freed from the valley, they remained trapped, speaking backward in their minds, thinking backward, existing in a temporal reality inverted from the rest of humanity. The cruelest part is that Cain believed this was protection. In his journal, in his final entries before his death in 1924, he wrote, "I have given these children a gift that no one can take from them, a language of safety, a mode of thought that makes them immune to the corruptions of the forward world. Even if the world discovers our valley, even if they try to take our children, those children will carry the protection inside themselves forever. I will die knowing I have created something eternal." He was right. The protection was eternal. But protection and prison are sometimes the same thing. The story of Silence Valley forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of community, the rights of parents, the obligations of the state, and the ethics of isolation. Elijah Cain wasn't a monster in the conventional sense. He was a father who'd lost his daughter to horrific violence and wanted to ensure no child would ever be vulnerable in that way again. His initial impulse, to protect children, was fundamentally human, even noble. But somewhere between impulse and implementation, between idea and execution, protection became control. Safety became isolation, and the desire to shield children from harm transformed into a system that harmed them directly in the name of protecting them from hypothetical future harm. The backward speech itself was neutral, a fascinating linguistic phenomenon that proved human brains can acquire language in reverse as easily as forward. But the context in which it was used, the enforcement mechanisms that ensured compliance, the punishment of children who tried to speak normally, that transformed a linguistic curiosity into systematic abuse, and perhaps most disturbing, many of the adults in Silence Valley genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They'd been raised in the system themselves. They'd never known a world where children weren't punished for speaking forward. The silence room, the isolation, the control, these weren't cruelties to them. These were necessary measures to preserve what they saw as a sacred trust. At what point does sincere belief excuse harm? At what point does tradition become tyranny? At what point does a community's right to self-determination collide with the individual rights of children born into that community? These questions don't have easy answers. Silence Valley makes us uncomfortable because it exists in the gray spaces between protection and abuse, between cultural preservation and child harm, between respecting isolation and intervening in suffering. The outside world looked at Silence Valley and saw backward speech as the problem. But backward speech was just a tool. The real problem was the belief that you could protect people by controlling them so completely that they couldn't function without that control. The real problem was a community that valued its own preservation more than the well-being of its most vulnerable members. The real problem was the willingness to sacrifice individual children to maintain collective ideology. And here's the truly haunting part: that impulse, to protect through control, to ensure safety through isolation, to sacrifice individual freedom for collective security, that's not unique to Silence Valley. It exists in various forms in communities around the world, in strict religious enclaves, in isolated political movements, in families that cut themselves off from the outside world to preserve their vision of purity. Silence Valley is an extreme example, but it's an example of something deeply human: the desire to build walls so high that nothing bad can get in, without recognizing that walls that keep threats out also keep people trapped inside. Today, if you visit the site where Silence Valley once stood, you'll find only forest. The valley has returned to wilderness, the cleared fields overgrown, the houses gone, the silence room destroyed. Only the cemetery remains, with its fence and its marker and its 23 graves. But on quiet days, when the wind moves through the trees in just the right way, people who have visited the cemetery report hearing something unsettling. A sound like voices, speaking in a cadence that's almost recognizable but not quite. Words that sound like English played in the wrong direction. Most dismiss it as wind in the leaves, as the mind playing tricks in a place with such dark history, as the natural tendency to hear patterns in random noise, especially when you know what used to happen in these woods. But some, particularly those who knew survivors of Silence Valley, who heard Rebecca Talbert's backward speech before she died, who listened to Catherine Moore's field recordings, some claim sounds are real, that there are still people in these mountains speaking backward, that Elijah Cain's linguistic experiment never truly ended. And whether that's legend or truth, whether it's collective delusion or hidden reality, the possibility itself is disturbing. The possibility that somewhere in these remote hollows, children are still being raised speaking backward, still being taught that the forward world is dangerous, that isolation is protection, that their inverted speech is a gift rather than a prison. We'll probably never know for certain. The Appalachian Mountains are vast, the isolated communities numerous and private, and the will to investigate largely exhausted by the failure to find the missing children of Silence Valley 50 years ago, which means if Elijah Cain's vision survives, it survives in exactly the way he intended, hidden, protected by isolation, preserved through the absolute control of language and thought. And that might be the most disturbing revelation of all. If this journey into the dark psychology of isolation, control, and backward speech has left you questioning the nature of protection and harm, if you find yourself lying awake tonight wondering about the children who were never found, then this channel has more uncomfortable truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the spaces where sincere belief becomes systematic abuse, where tradition becomes tyranny, where protection becomes prison. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than fascination, if it made you question what we're willing to sacrifice in the name of keeping others safe. And in the comments, I want to know, if you'd been born in Silence Valley, raised speaking backward, taught that the forward world was corruption, would you have tried to escape, even knowing you'd never truly belong anywhere again? Or would you have chosen to stay, to perpetuate the system, to believe the isolation was protection rather than face the terrifying freedom of a world you couldn't fully navigate? Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to see how easily protection becomes control, how naturally we build prisons and call them safety, and how the impulse to save can become the mechanism of harm. That's the darkness we're really afraid of, not the backward speech, not the silence room, but the recognition that, given the right circumstances, given enough fear and enough conviction, we might do exactly the same thing. The story of Silence Valley isn't over. Somewhere in these mountains, the experiment might still be continuing. And we'll never know for certain if the voices some people hear in those empty woods are wind in the trees or children speaking backward, trapped in a linguistic prison we've chosen to ignore because confronting it would be too difficult, too expensive, too uncomfortable. Some silences, it turns out, we choose to preserve, and that might be the cruelest protection of all.